Grading In-Shell Pecans by Matthew Bailey. The pecan, or pecan, is a species of hickory native to south-central North America. Today, the U.S. produces between 80 and 95% of the world's pecans, with an annual crop of 100 to 200,000 tons from more than 10 million trees. The nut harvest for growers is typically around mid-October, lasting until January. Historically, the leading pecan-producing state in the U.S. has been Georgia. There are two main classes of pecans: improved varieties, which make up 25%, and seedlings, which make up 75%. Improved varieties are trees which have been grafted to a particular cultivar. Seedlings are trees which have not been grafted and have no particular cultivar type. Items needed in order to grade in-shell pecans will be as follows: a scale for weighing and measuring weights in grams or pound ounces, a sizing card, a nut cracker, a sampling board, our sampling worksheet, grading worksheet, a paper bag, a color card, sampling probe, adequate lighting, clean white paper, large format preferably, and a pen or pencil. Sample acquisition. When sampling pecans, it is typical to encounter either super sacks, which are sacks containing between 1,000 and 2,000 pounds of pecans, 50-pound bags, which contain 50 pounds of pecans, typically white polywoven bags, or jute bags, which are made up of burlap, large sacks typically containing around 100 to 150 pounds. It is important that all containers be accessible. You can use the chart here in order to determine how many containers need to be sampled from, depending on how many you have for the entire lot. For example, if you have 50 plus containers for the entire lot, you would pull 1 out of every 10. If you have between 5 and 50, you would pull from at least 5 to acquire your sample. If you have less than 5 containers, you will sample from all 5 containers. When you are dealing with super sacks, which is very common in the southeast, you will pull from every super sack. How to sample? You will collect the nuts from each container at random with your hands or a sampling probe or both. Once you've retrieved the nuts, put them in your sampling bag. Sample acquisition. The USDA has formed a chart determining how many pounds of pecans must be sampled with how many relevant nuts to pull for various weights. The chart here shows the size of the sample. If it's between 0 and 15,000 pounds, you will need 100 nut sample. Between 15,001 and 30,000 pounds, you will need 2 100 nut samples, or 200 nuts. From 30,001 pounds to 60,000 pounds, you'll need a minimum of 3 100 nut samples, or 300 nuts. For each additional 20,000 pounds above 60,000 pounds, or fraction thereof, use 100 additional nuts for sampling purposes. Be sure and fill in all the information in your sampling worksheet at the time of the sample acquisition in order to record who the sample belongs to and the sample ID.
When filling out your sample acquisition page, you'll need to have a sample ID, which is a unique number that identifies the sample, sampler's name, the date the sample was taken, owner and producer information, Any and all information that you can acquire is good to allow the grower to know exactly what sample came from where. Grower's name or company name, the orchard the harvest came from, and subsections if they want to get that specific. The date of harvest and harvest conditions if available. Many times these items will not be available, but if they are, definitely want to put it down. On to sampling information. The cleaner, which is the company or farm, which is typically the same as the owner, but in this case it is not. Someone is using Gum Pond Farms to clean their pecans. The location of the cleaner. Packaging information such as super sacks, 50-pound bags, or other, and you can write in. In this case it was super sacks. On this particular sample there were 6 bags available for sampling. That was the total lot, and that will hold true for this particular sample. If they were to add to it at a later date, it would not apply to this sample. We sampled every bag, as you can see here indicated, and the total weight is all the bags added together. That is the total weight of the lot. Any notes that you might want to put in can be identified there.
Inspecting the sample. Once you've acquired your sample, you will then need to sample it and inspect it as soon as possible. When inspecting the sample, you will determine the following various characteristics. Size, determined by count per pound, uniformity and diameter. The appearance of the nut, determined by the color and defects. The moisture content of the nuts, as well as the meat yield of the nuts. Inspecting the sample for size. There is no size requirement in either the US number 1 or US number 2 grade. However, size is usually specified in connection with the grade. The U.S. standards provide size designation which may be used in specifying size and which are based upon the combination of count per pound and weight of the 10 smallest nuts in a representative 100 nut sample. Size also may be specified in accordance with the maximum number per pound or the range in number per pound with reference to the weight of the smallest nuts. The size may also be specified as an exact number per pound. In addition, size may be described in terms of the diameter of the smallest nuts or the range in diameters stated in 1/16 of an inch. In most lots, the size will be specified in terms of definite size designations such as medium, large, etc. When the size is not specified, the count per pound and weight of the 10 smallest nuts per 100 should be determined and reported under the size heading.
Inspection and grading. We'll run through this sheet quickly. We have nuts per pound, uniformity, diameter of the nut, color of the shells, finish of the shells, defects, and meat yield. These are ordered this way to make it easiest for the sampler. Starting off with nuts per pound.
Count per pound. Weigh as nearly as possible any even pound of pecans from the mixed sample. If gram scales are used, the pound equivalent weight is 453.6 grams. Count the nuts and record the count.
Change the units to pound. Zero out the scale so that is not included in the weight. 62.
Weigh and count a second pound, average the two counts, and if the average count is clearly within the count range specified for the one size classification, that shall be the count reported for the lot. However, if the average of the two is on the borderline between two size classifications, make one or two more counts and average all of them to help decide which size classification should be given to the lot.
Well, my first count was 62, and I have enough nuts in my sample to run it again, and hopefully one more time. If not, I will average it between only the two, and that will give me my average nuts per pound.
Uniformity. This is done by percentage weight of the 10 smallest nuts per 100. Count out 100 nuts at random from the mixed sample. Weigh the 100 nuts, preferably on gram scales, but on pound-ounce scales if they are the only ones available. Record the weight to the nearest gram, or in ounces to the nearest 1/4 of an ounce.
Weighing your 100 nut sample for uniformity. Again, it's very simple. Zero out so that you're not including the weight of that. I've already counted out my 100 nut sample. And record the weight.
Spread the 100 nuts in a single layer so that all may be seen at one time. Carefully select 10 which appear to be the smallest among the 100. Sometimes it is easier to pick out 12 to 15 or more to start with, and then reduce the group down to 10 by putting back those in the group which appear to be larger.
As you can see, I've arranged my 100 nut sample on the board for inspection. I've done this for two reasons. First, I'll weigh the nuts. They do not have to be on the board, but this makes it simpler for the next step, which will be to remove the 10 smallest. Once you've recorded the weight of the 100 nut sample, record it on the inspection worksheet and remove the 10 smallest.
Weigh the 10 smallest nuts to the nearest gram or to the nearest 1/8 of an ounce and record the weight on the sample worksheet.
Weighing your 10 nut sample. This would be the 10 smallest nuts from the board after inspection. After you go through your 100 nut sample, find the 10 smallest and weigh them. Sometimes it is easiest to get 12 to 15 nuts to choose from those of the 10 smallest. Zero out your scale and record the weight.
Now, divide the weight of the 10 smallest nuts by the weight of the 100 nut sample to obtain the percentage weight of the 10 smallest nuts. Regardless of the number of nuts per pound, the lot cannot meet any size classification if the 10 smallest nuts weigh less than 7% of the weight of the 100 nut sample.
This is to determine if the sample meets the requirements for a US number 1.
Inspecting the sample size by diameter. Using the sizing card, measure all of the nuts in the 100 nut sample and record each on the worksheet.
A simple sizing card. This one is actually steel. It's much simpler to have a lighter one. And write down the size of each individual nut. That one is above 16. I'll just put a plus sign. 16, 15, 16, 15. If the nut will not go through the hole, that is not the designation for the nut. You should not at any time force the nut through a hole. 16. 16. 16. And 15.
Determine the average size by adding all the sizes together and dividing by 100. Record also the largest size and the smallest size on the worksheet in the space provided. Inspecting the sample for appearance. Foreign material.
Foreign material. I have not personally run across a sample of such poor quality where there was any significant amount of foreign material. If, however, you have a 100 nut sample and have significant foreign material in that sample, you would need to remove the foreign material from the sample, weigh it separately, and record the weight on the worksheet in the space provided.
Color of shells. Inspect the sample visually on your sample board and choose one of the following statements that best describes the color of the shells. Uniform in color, fairly uniform in color, irregular in color, or damaged in general appearance. Uniform in color should be applied only to the best lots with no more than very slight variations between nuts and none with distinct contrasting color. Fairly uniform in color will be applicable to the great majority of lots which have had uniform treatment of shells or which are natural. As a guide, a lot may have up to, but not over, 5% nuts with sharply contrasting color, and the lot still be classified as fairly uniform. Irregular in color will be the term to describe lots which have a mixture of contrasting colors. Even though most of the nuts may be classified as fairly uniform, the lot as a whole shall be classed as irregular if it contains more than 5% nuts of sharply contrasting color. Damaged in general appearance may be used to describe lots containing very many slight shell blemishes, even though most of them are not large enough to be scored on the individual nut basis. Such lots fail to meet the requirements of both US number 1 and US number 2, even though they may meet the internal quality requirements.
In the particular lot that we are grading, this nut has staining. That would need to be recorded, not on an individual nut basis, but according to the guidelines laid out in the sample sheet, according to the USDA.
Finish of shell.
In this section, you will gauge the general appearance of the shells if they have had any sort of finish applied to them. The choices are natural, which would refer to having nothing done to them, bleached, dyed, or waxed, and each are pretty self-explanatory. In the notes section of this, you may want to write any comments that you feel are relevant to the sample.
Inspecting the sample appearance. Defects.
This section is quite important because you will need to gauge every individual nut and check it for any of the following damages. There are two categories of damage: damage and serious damage. Adhering hull or dark stains affecting an aggregate of more than 5% of the shell would fall under damage but not serious damage. The same affecting more than 20% of the shell would fall under serious damage. This nut is a good example. It has light staining, but is not affecting more than 5% of the entire shell. This nut, out of the sample, also has damage. It does not, however, have serious damage. This one would be borderline, and I will need to measure to be certain because this could fall under the section of serious damage where broken shells when missing portion is greater than a circle 1/4 inch. This one actually probably does fall under serious damage. Any nuts that are found need to be written down on a nut-by-nut basis. Meaning, if I were to find 5 nuts that fit the last description, I would write 5 here in the blank. And so on and so forth for each one. After inspecting all nuts, you may find some with damage and or serious damage. The one I hold here is an example of serious damage. This one falls under the classification of a broken shell where the missing portion is greater than 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. You'll notice with the scale, this is larger than 1/4 inch. This nut would fall under only damage, not serious damage. If you can tell with the lighting, I don't know if that's any better or not, probably not. It has minor staining, but since it is not more than 5% of the shell, it falls under just standard damage and not serious damage. This particular nut has a crack. This particular crack
Inspecting the sample, moisture content. Using a moisture meter, measure the moisture of the nut and record on the worksheet. Repeat this 2 more times to get an average of the 3 readings. Inspecting the sample, meat yield.
This is the last section on the worksheet, with reason because you will be destroying all of the nuts. In this section you crack all the nuts out of the 100 nut sample, 100 nuts in total. And separate all kernels and separate all edible meat kernel and separate all edible meats from the hulls and non-edible materials. And with a little video magic, I will be done way faster than normal. Now you will definitely break some, but it's important to get all edible meats into your edible meat container and no foreign products or hulls or non-edible materials in that container. When completed, you'll simply weigh the edible meats and record it, which will give you your percentage of meat yield.
Once you've completed this, weigh the edible kernels and record the weight on the worksheet. Next, record the meat yield percentage on the worksheet by dividing the weight of the edible kernels by the weight of the 100 nut sample. Once this is completed, be sure to check over your worksheet to make sure you didn't miss any sections and that all spaces are completed. The check sample. A check sample should be kept for 30 days from the date of the grading of the sample. The check sample should be kept in a cool, dry place with temperatures reaching no more than 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius.